You wake up, it is 35 degrees Celsius outside. The wind does not knock, it invades. Your children are pressed against you, sharing the only warmth that exists in this world, each other. The fire from last night is nearly gone, just a faint orange pulse buried under ash, like a heartbeat refusing to stop. You have maybe 60 seconds to bring it back before the cold wins. This is not a story from a movie. This is not fiction. This was Tuesday morning, 20,000 years ago. And here is what no history book tells you. Those people did not merely endure the Ice Age. They decoded it. They turned frozen stone into architecture, silence into music, darkness into meaning. By the time this ends, you will never look at a flame or a shadow the same way again. The period scientists call the Late Pleistocene reached its most extreme point approximately 26,500 to 19,000 years ago, a window confirmed by ice core studies drilled from both Greenland and Antarctica. Global temperatures dropped an estimated 4 to 8 degrees Celsius below today's averages. That may sound modest, it was not. Ice sheets stretched across the entirety of modern Scandinavia, Britain, and northern North America, in places reaching 3 to 4 kilometers thick. To put that into a scale your mind can actually hold, the entire island of Great Britain lay buried under ice, taller than 3 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of each other. Sea levels fell approximately 120 to 130 meters below where they stand today, exposing vast land bridges that connected continents we now consider permanently separate. And humanity. Where was humanity in all of this? Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that in Europe alone, the total human population may have compressed to somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 individuals, sheltering in a handful of ice-free refuges scattered across southern France, northern Spain, and isolated pockets of Central Europe. The entire surviving population of a continent, small enough to fill a single modern stadium, surrounded by silence, surrounded by ice, surrounded by darkness that lasted for months. And yet, they painted. Not because someone told them to, not because survival demanded it. They pressed their hands against cold stone walls and blew pigment around their fingers, leaving a mark that would outlast every empire, every dynasty, every civilization that followed them. That single fact should stop you completely, because it means that even at the absolute edge of human extinction, when every calorie mattered, when every hour of warmth was borrowed time, something inside them refused to only survive. Something inside them needed to mean something. But before we ask why they painted, we need to understand where they lived. Because the cave was not simply a shelter. It was an engineering decision. One that determined whether those 10,000 people became our ancestors or became the end of the story entirely. The entrance mattered more than anything else. Not the depth of the cave, not the size, not how hidden it was from predators or rival groups. The single most critical factor in choosing where 20 or 30 human lives would be anchored through a winter that could last 7 months was which direction the opening faced. Caves oriented toward the south in the northern hemisphere received direct sunlight during the shortest days of the year. That sunlight did not just provide light, it provided degrees, and in an environment where the difference between 3 degrees Celsius and -3 degrees Celsius inside a shelter could determine whether an infant survived the night, every degree carried the weight of a life. The height of the entrance above the surrounding ground determined whether the cave would stay dry through the thaw season or flood when snowmelt arrived in spring. Too low, and the shelter that kept you alive through winter would drown you in April. The elevation of the threshold was not a preference, it was a calculation. Depth presented its own brutal trade-offs. Shallow caves offered better airflow and easier defense. Deeper caves offered thermal stability and room to divide life into zones. Sleeping here, working there, fire in the center, ceremony somewhere further back where the darkness became complete. But depth also meant absolute blackness beyond the firelight. It meant the risk of losing orientation inside a labyrinth of stone. It meant the animals who also needed shelter, cave bears, cave lions, cave hyenas, had likely already made the same calculation and gotten there first. Choosing a cave was not an act of desperation. It was an act of architecture, the first real estate decision in human history, and the stakes were the lives of everyone you loved. Once chosen, the interior was never left in its raw state. The zone near the entrance, where natural light still reached during brief daylight hours, became the workshop: stone knapping, hide scraping, food processing, horizon watching. Further inside, temperature stabilized, protected from wind that made exterior cold genuinely lethal. This middle zone housed the hearths, and the hearth was everything. Here is what textbooks reduced to a single line: fire provided warmth and light, and what that reduction completely fails to capture. The fire was the only reason the group existed as a group. Around it, the injured were kept alive through nights that would otherwise kill them. Around it, the elderly sat and spoke, and what they spoke was the only library these people had. Every hunting route memorized over 40 years, every plant that healed, and every plant that killed, every winter that had come before, and how it had been survived. That knowledge lived in one place only, inside the minds of the people sitting closest to the flame. The fire was not a tool, it was the nervous system of the entire community. Keeping it alive through a 7-month winter presented challenges beyond simply finding fuel. In regions most affected by glacial advance, forests had retreated or disappeared entirely, replaced by open tundra. Wood was scarce, so these people burned what the landscape actually offered: bone. The bones of mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses, dense with fat even after the flesh was gone, burned slowly and hot. Archaeological excavations at sites across Ukraine and the Czech Republic have uncovered hearths containing burnt remains of hundreds of mammoth bones, evidence not of single kills, but of systematic, long-term fuel management across multiple seasons. Animal fat fueled small stone lamps for detailed work. In the most resource-scarce moments, dried herbivore dung served as emergency fuel. Nothing that could burn was wasted. But fire inside an enclosed stone space creates a problem that could kill you as efficiently as the cold outside: smoke. These caves had no chimneys, no ventilation shafts, and yet the people who lived in them solved this through something more reliable than engineering: observation. Smoke rises. It accumulates at the highest points before finding any exit. The inhabitants watched that movement, over days, over seasons, over generations, and learned exactly where natural air currents ran. They placed their hearths not where it was convenient, but where the invisible architecture of airflow made it survivable. Some sites show hearths positioned with extraordinary precision, relative to natural fissures in the rock ceiling, gaps that functioned as the world's first ventilation system. They did not have physics. They had something older: attention. The kind of attention that only develops when the cost of not paying it is death. When the fire was positioned and burning, they built inward. Using long bones as posts, stretched hides as walls, and heavy stones as anchors, they constructed internal partitions, smaller spaces within the larger space, private zones for individual families nested inside the communal shelter. These structures trapped heat and held it close to human bodies through the night. The floor beneath them was never bare stone. Layer upon layer of animal skins, dried moss, crushed herbs, and fine branches created insulated sleeping surfaces that archaeology has since been able to read like pages, each layer representing a season, each renewal marking another winter survived. They went to sleep on the accumulated evidence of their own endurance. And every morning the first act was not to eat, it was not to speak. It was to find the embers buried under ash the night before, deliberately preserved in a technique that saved the exhausting labor of generating fire from scratch, and breathe them back to life. The most important skill of the Ice Age was not starting fire. It was keeping it. Food was never guaranteed, not for a single day. This is the fact that modern life has made almost impossible to truly feel. That the question of whether you would eat tomorrow was not anxiety, not pessimism, not a disorder to be treated. It was simply the accurate assessment of reality. Every calorie that entered the body of an Ice Age human had been thought about, planned for, fought for, or carefully preserved against the moment when the landscape offered nothing at all. The popular image of these people as pure hunters, powerful figures bringing down mammoths in dramatic confrontations across frozen plains, is not wrong exactly. It is incomplete in a way that fundamentally misrepresents how they actually stayed alive. Large game hunting happened. It was real, it was extraordinary, and when it succeeded, it provided an abundance that could sustain a group for weeks. Mammoths, steppe bison, woolly rhinoceroses, wild horses, reindeer, hunted with coordinated strategies that required planning, communication, and a willingness to accept serious physical risk. A wounded mammoth does not stop being dangerous. A hunt that went wrong did not mean an empty stomach. It meant someone did not come home. But these hunts were relatively rare. The daily nutritional reality was built on something far less dramatic and far more intelligent: diversification. Small and medium animals provided protein in a consistent, predictable way that large hunting could not. Arctic hares, rock ptarmigans, foxes, marmots, and rodents fell regularly into engineered traps. Spear throwers, atlatls, multiplied the force and range of a thrown projectile, allowing hunters to take birds and smaller mammals from distances that minimized risk and maximized efficiency. Fishing in rivers and lakes that remained partially unfrozen through underground thermal currents provided another critical protein source during months when other options contracted towards zero. Fish bones are fragile and difficult to preserve, which is why fishing leaves less visible traces in the archaeological record. But isotopic analysis of human skeletal remains from this period consistently shows marine and freshwater protein signatures. Fishing was not occasional, it was structural. Plant resources never disappeared entirely, even in deep winter. Those who knew the landscape, and these people knew it the way a musician knows a piece of music played 10,000 times, could locate edible roots beneath the snow, lichens on exposed rock faces, inner bark from certain trees that provided carbohydrates when nothing else was available. Rodent burrows sometimes yielded cached seeds, effectively outsourcing part of the foraging labor to creatures whose instincts had already identified the most nutritious available food in the territory. But abundance, when it came, created its own urgent problem. A successful mammoth hunt produced more meat than 30 people could eat before it spoiled, unless they had already solved the preservation problem. And they had, with the same quiet ingenuity that characterized everything else they did. The cold itself was the first tool. Specific areas within the cave where temperatures remained constantly below freezing functioned as natural storage. The world's first refrigerators, carved not by human hands but by geology, managed by human intention. But cold alone was not always enough, so they developed parallel technologies. Thin strips of meat hung near the hearth, close enough for smoke to penetrate the flesh, far enough that heat remained gentle rather than cooking. The smoke carried antimicrobial compounds that inhibited decomposition. The mild warmth accelerated moisture evaporation. What emerged was something remarkably similar to what the native peoples of North America would later call pemmican: dried meat combined with rendered fat, sometimes mixed with dried berries. Dense, compact, extraordinarily calorie-rich, and stable enough to last an entire winter without refrigeration. The world's first energy bar, engineered approximately 20,000 years before anyone thought to put one in a foil wrapper. Isotopic analysis of teeth and bones from this period reveals something that continues to surprise researchers. These people ate more diversely than almost any subsequent human population until the modern era. Their diet shifted seasonally, opportunistically, intelligently. They were not locked into a single strategy. They were reading the landscape in real time and responding with flexibility that modern nutritional science would recognize as genuinely sophisticated. They did not eat well despite the Ice Age. They ate well because they understood the Ice Age completely. The tools that made all of this possible were the product of knowledge accumulated across thousands of years and passed forward with the same care as fire, deliberately, precisely, with the understanding that losing this knowledge was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence for everyone who came after. Lithic technology during the Upper Paleolithic had reached levels of refinement that continue to astonish materials scientists today. Extracting long, thin, geometrically precise blades from cores of flint and obsidian required an understanding of how these stones fracture, built not from theory, but from tens of thousands of hours of practice across generations. A single mistake could destroy hours of work and waste material that may have been carried hundreds of kilometers to reach this place. Scrapers processed hides with efficiency that matched the task exactly. Projectile points were thinned and balanced with a precision that affected flight trajectory. Not simply sharp rocks attached to sticks, but engineered components of a weapon system. Burins allowed engraving of bone, antler, and mammoth ivory into needles, hooks, harpoon heads, and spear thrower components, each object representing hours of focused labor and the transfer of knowledge from one generation's hands into the next. The needle deserves particular attention. A bone needle with a perforated eye, small enough to fit between two fingers, strong enough to pierce multiple layers of hide, was arguably one of the most consequential inventions in the entire history of human survival. Without it, tight-fitting multi-layered clothing was impossible. Without that clothing, the colonization of Arctic latitudes was impossible. A small bone, a small hole. The difference between extinction and everything that followed. The clothing these needles made possible operated on a principle modern cold-weather gear still relies on entirely: layering. The innermost layer used the softest materials: Arctic hair fur, fox pelt, fine reindeer underfur, trapping warm air against the body while wicking moisture away from the skin. Middle layers added insulation. The outer layer faced wind and weather directly, and for this, the hide of the reindeer was the material of choice. Reindeer fur is biologically unusual. Each individual hair is hollow, an air-filled shaft providing insulation significantly superior to the solid-haired pelts of most other mammals. These people did not know the microscopic reason, but they knew, from experience passed down across generations, that reindeer hide kept you warmer than anything else the landscape offered. They selected it deliberately. They processed it carefully. They wore it strategically. Transforming a raw hide into wearable material was itself a technology of considerable complexity. Every trace of fat, connective tissue, and flesh had to be removed. Anything left behind would rot and destroy the material. Then it required treatment to prevent stiffening. Some communities used the animal's own brain, rich in fats and lecithins that kept the hide permanently supple. Others used fermented urine, whose ammonia acted as a natural tanning agent. Final smoking provided additional protection against moisture and decay. This was not primitive. This was chemistry, empirical, practical, encoded not in written language but in the muscle memory of every person who had learned it from the person before them. And the clothing they made carried meaning beyond warmth. Beads carved from mammoth ivory, perforated predator teeth worn at the neck, shells transported from coastlines hundreds of kilometers distant, traded through networks connecting groups who may never have met directly. These were not casual decorations. They were statements, communicating status, achievement, and identity in a world where knowing who someone was could be the difference between being welcomed and being turned away. Being turned away in winter, far from your own shelter, was a sentence no one needed to have written explicitly. They dressed for survival, and they dressed to be known. There is a number that appears consistently across human societies, separated by thousands of years and thousands of kilometers. Societies that never contacted each other, never shared language, never traded goods or ideas across the distances that divided them. That number is approximately 20 to 50. It is the size of the bands that inhabited the caves of Ice Age Europe. It is the size of the hunting groups documented among the historic peoples of the Arctic. It is the size of the basic social unit that appears again and again in the ethnographic record of hunter-gatherer societies studied across the 19th and 20th centuries on every inhabited continent. It is not a coincidence, it is biology. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar proposed, based on the relationship between primate brain size and social group complexity, that the human neocortex is calibrated to maintain stable, trust-based relationships with approximately 150 individuals, what has since become known as Dunbar's number. But within that outer boundary exists an inner core, the group small enough that every member knows every other member, not just by name, but by history, by temperament, by what they are capable of under pressure. That inner core is 20 to 50 people. This was not a social preference. It was a cognitive architecture. The Ice Age band was the size it was because that was the size the human brain had evolved to manage. The number of people among whom genuine trust, genuine cooperation, and genuine sacrifice became possible. And sacrifice was not metaphorical. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites across Europe and Asia documents something that should stop every person who has ever assumed that moral complexity is a modern invention. Skeletal remains showing healed injuries so severe that the individuals could not have survived without sustained care from others. A skeleton from Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, predating the last glacial maximum, and noted here as context rather than direct evidence for this specific period, showed an individual who had lived for years with a withered arm, significant vision impairment, and severe lower body injuries. This person had been fed, had been sheltered, had been kept alive by people who received nothing economically measurable in return. In a world where every calorie required effort and every able body was a resource the group could not easily replace, These people chose to carry someone who could not carry themselves. That choice had a name, even if they had no word for it. We call it compassion. And the evidence suggests it was not occasional. It was structural, woven into the way these groups functioned at the most fundamental level. The role of women within these communities has been consistently misread by interpretations that imported the assumptions of later agricultural societies backward onto a world those assumptions do not fit. The division of labor in Ice Age bands was almost certainly more fluid, more situational, and more responsive to individual capacity than the rigid gender structures that emerged with settled farming thousands of years later. Female burials recovered from Upper Paleolithic sites across Russia and Eastern Europe contain grave goods, ochre, ivory beads, perforated shells, indicating high social status by any reasonable interpretation. Some contain weapons. Some contain tools of specialized craft production. The individuals interred with these objects were not defined by a single role. They were recognized as people of consequence: hunters, craftspeople, knowledge holders, decision makers. The care of children was not the exclusive province of biological mothers. It was distributed across the group in a system modern developmental psychology would recognize as extraordinarily effective, what researchers now call alloparenting. In a world where a single hunting accident or illness could remove a parent permanently, a child whose survival depended entirely on two specific adults was a child in constant existential danger. A child embedded in a network of caring relationships across 20 or 30 adults was a child with genuine resilience. This was not sentimentality. It was engineering. Social engineering as sophisticated and intentional as the fire management, the cave selection, and the layered clothing. They looked at the problem of keeping children alive in an environment trying to kill everyone, and solved it the same way they solved every other problem, collectively. Education had no institutions, no curriculum, no designated teachers, and no separation between learning and living. A 5-year-old gathering dry wood alongside an adult was not doing a chore while education happened somewhere else. The gathering was the education. The observation of how the adult assessed which wood burned best, which branches were too green, how much was needed for a night, repeated daily across years, was the curriculum. By adolescence, a young person in an Ice Age band had accumulated a practical knowledge base the modern world would struggle to replicate in twice the time. They learned by watching. They learned by doing. They learned by being trusted with real consequences, while still young enough that the adults around them were paying close attention. And then there was the part of their lives that no purely functional analysis can reach. Deep inside many inhabited caves, not in the living areas, not near the hearths, not in the workshop zones near the entrance, there are chambers. Some require crawling through passages so narrow that a person must exhale completely to fit through. Some are accessible only after traversing underground routes in total darkness, with no natural light and no margin for navigational error. In these chambers, far beyond the reach of daily life, the walls speak. The paintings at Chauvet Cave in southern France, dated to approximately 36,000 years ago, among the oldest known figurative art in the world, display horses, rhinoceroses, lions, bears, and aurochs, rendered with technical mastery that caused researchers who first encountered them in 1994 to question their authenticity. The perspective, the use of natural rock contours to create three-dimensional form, the overlapping figures suggesting movement. These were not tentative marks of beings just discovering representation. These were the work of artists who had been making art and thinking about art for a very long time. The specific location of these paintings matters as much as their content. The difficulty of reaching the deepest chambers was not a practical obstacle to be minimized. Current evidence suggests it may have been an intentional feature, that the journey through darkness and physical constriction was itself part of whatever these spaces meant. Moving from the firelit world of daily life into absolute darkness, through passages requiring the body to become smaller and more vulnerable, into a chamber where the walls were alive with painted figures. That sequence was likely structured, not accidental. Torch marks on ceilings. Charcoal from ceremonial fires that were not cooking fires. Objects arranged with intentional placement rather than casual habitation. These spaces were visited repeatedly, over generations, by people who treated them as different in kind. Places where ordinary rules gave way to something requiring a different quality of attention. What that something was precisely remains genuinely unknown. We can say these spaces were treated as sacred in the functional sense, set apart, returned to, maintained with deliberate care. We cannot say with certainty what stories were told inside them, what the figures meant to those who painted them, or what a person was supposed to carry back out through the narrow passages into the world of fire and food and survival. But we have one piece of evidence that requires no interpretation. Scattered across the decorated caves of Europe, sometimes among the animal figures, sometimes alone on blank stone, are human hands, created by placing the hand flat against rock and blowing pigment around it, so that the hand itself becomes an absence defined by color, a negative space, somehow more present than the surrounding stone. These hands belong to men, women, and children. Analysis of finger ratios and hand dimensions has allowed researchers to identify individual hands appearing in multiple locations within the same cave, the same person, returning, pressing the same hand against the same stone, in what begins to look less like decoration and more like a practice. A ritual of return, a statement renewed. The oldest confirmed bone flute found to date, carved from the wing bone of a griffin vulture, recovered from Hohlefels Cave in Germany, has been dated to approximately 43,000 years ago. It has 4 finger holes, precisely spaced to produce a pentatonic scale. Someone made this with intention, someone played it, and the darkness of a cave in winter, with the fire burning and the wind outside, and the people who were everything pressed close together, that was the concert hall. They were not waiting for civilization to begin before they started being fully human. They were already there. And perhaps the most quietly devastating evidence of all is this. Some of those hands on the cave walls, the small ones, belonging to children brought into those deep chambers and shown something their community believed was worth the journey through darkness to see. Those children grew up. They had children of their own. They brought those children back to the same walls, pressed their hands against the same stone, blew the same pigment, generation after generation, in the same darkness, making the same gesture. I was here. We were here. Remember us. The ice did not retreat overnight. It withdrew the way it had advanced, slowly, indifferently, across timescales that made a single human life feel like a breath held and released. Beginning approximately 19,000 years ago, global temperatures began a gradual climb that would continue, with interruptions, for the next 10,000 years. The ice sheets that had buried entire continents began to thin at their edges. Meltwater carved new rivers. Coastlines shifted as sea levels rose, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, reclaiming the land bridges that had once connected Britain to continental Europe, Alaska to Asia, land masses that would now be separated by water for the remainder of human history. For the communities that had built their entire existence around glacial conditions, this was not straightforwardly good news. The megafauna that had sustained the hunting economy for tens of thousands of years faced pressures from 2 directions simultaneously: the transformation of their habitats as cold steppe gave way to boreal forest, and the intensification of human hunting by populations equipped with increasingly refined weapons and increasingly sophisticated coordination. The woolly mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, the cave bear, the cave lion, these animals did not disappear because the Ice Age ended. The picture is considerably more complicated than that, and researchers continue to debate the relative weight of climate change versus human predation in driving these extinctions. What is clear is that by approximately 10,000 years ago, the ecological world that had defined human life for 20 millennia was gone. The landscape that replaced it was different in almost every dimension. Forests expanded northward, covering territories that had been open hunting grounds. The great herds that had moved in predictable patterns across treeless plains, herds that an experienced hunter could locate, intercept, and drive, using techniques refined over generations, fragmented and dispersed into woodland environments, where those same techniques were largely useless. New strategies were required. New knowledge had to be built from the beginning, or adapted from what existed, in a world that no longer resembled the one the old knowledge had been designed for. And the caves, those extraordinary shelters that had served as the fixed points around which entire lives had been organized, began, gradually, to lose their centrality. The advantages that had made a well-chosen cave the optimal human habitat during the glacial peak diminished as conditions moderated. The thermal mass of stone that had retained heat through the coldest winters now felt less essential when winters themselves were becoming shorter and less severe. The permanent locations that had once been a strength, a known, defensible, thermally stable shelter within a known territory, became a constraint as the resources that had sustained life in those territories shifted or disappeared. Human groups began building, not renovating natural spaces but constructing from the ground up, portable, adaptable dwellings that could follow the resources rather than waiting for the resources to come to them. Frames of mammoth bone and wooden poles, covered with layered hides, insulated and weighted against wind. Dwellings that a group could disassemble, carry, and reassemble in days. Dwellings whose location was a choice renewed each season, rather than an inheritance passed down unchanged. The archaeological record of this transitional period, roughly 15,000 to 10,000 years ago, preserves evidence of this shift in the form of open-air sites across Eastern Europe and the Russian plain, where the remains of these constructed shelters have been found. At Mezhirich in modern Ukraine, the remains of 4 dwellings built using the bones of approximately 149 mammoths have been excavated and dated to around 15,000 years ago. These were not temporary camps. They were engineered structures, built with knowledge of load-bearing principles, insulation, and spatial organization. The architectural tradition that had begun inside caves, now liberated from the rock that had originally contained it. The transition was not a rupture, it was a continuation. But something important was carried forward that was not structural, not technological, not nutritional. The caves did not become simply abandoned spaces when the last family moved out. They became something else, something that may tell us more about these people than any tool, or bone, or carefully preserved ember. They became places of return. Evidence from multiple sites across Europe indicates that caves which had ceased to function as permanent habitations continued to receive human visitors for centuries, and in some cases millennia after daily life had moved elsewhere. The paintings in some chambers were added to across vast spans of time. Different artistic hands, different periods, the same walls. Burials were placed in caves long after the caves had stopped being homes. Objects were deposited in locations that suggest intentional offering rather than casual loss. The people who had been born in these caves, or whose parents had been born in them, or whose stories located the origin of everything meaningful in the firelit interior of a particular stone chamber, those people did not simply walk away. They kept coming back. They brought their dead. They brought their ceremonies. They brought their children and showed them the paintings on the walls and told them, in whatever language they spoke, whatever it was that those images meant. The cave had stopped being a shelter. It had become an ancestor. And this, more than the tools, more than the clothing, more than the preserved food and the engineered hearths and the carefully selected cave entrances, this may be the most recognizably human thing these people ever did. They attached meaning to a place. They made a location into a story. They decided that where something had happened mattered, that the stone that had witnessed their survival deserved to be returned to, that the darkness which had sheltered their most vulnerable moments was worth crossing again and again, not because it offered anything practical, but because it offered something that practical things cannot provide. It offered continuity. The genetic legacy of these people is not abstract. Modern analysis of ancient DNA extracted from Upper Paleolithic remains confirms direct ancestral continuity between the cave-dwelling populations of Ice Age Europe and the populations that inhabit Europe today. The people who painted at Chauvet, who carved the Venus figurines, who buried their dead with ochre and ivory and shells carried from distant coastlines, they are not a separate human story that ended and was replaced. They are a chapter of the story that continues. Their choices, their adaptations, their losses, and their persistence are written in the biology of people alive right now, reading or listening to this. You carry approximately 2 to 4% Neanderthal DNA, confirmed by genomic studies published over the past 15 years, inherited from encounters between modern humans and Neanderthal populations that occurred during the very period this story has described. The Ice Age was not only the backdrop against which our ancestors survived, it was the crucible in which the specific genetic and cultural identity of modern humanity was forged. There are things we will never know. We will not know what language they spoke in the firelit interior of the cave, what words existed for the feeling of surviving another winter, what name they gave to the animal painted on the deepest wall. We will not know what they believed happened after death, whether they had a concept that functioned like hope, what they told their children about the darkness and what lived inside it. The most intimate architecture of their inner lives, the dreams, the fears, the private language of a people who left no written record, is beyond recovery. Every archaeologist who works on this period knows this, and lives with it as both a limitation and a reminder that the past is not a problem to be fully solved, but a presence to be continually engaged. What we do know is this: somewhere between 26,000 and 19,000 years ago, on a continent buried under ice, a small number of human beings, perhaps no more than would fill a single modern building, kept a fire burning. They kept it burning through winters that lasted 7 months. They kept it burning while they sewed clothing precise enough to survive Arctic temperatures, while they painted animals on walls that no one outside their group would see for 30,000 years, while they fed people who could not feed themselves, and taught children everything they knew, and pressed their hands against cold stone and blew color around their fingers in the dark. They did not know they were the ancestors of 8 billion people. They did not know that the fire they were keeping alive was, in some way that transcends metaphor, still burning. But it is. Every structure built against the cold, every story told to make the darkness navigable, every choice to care for someone who cannot immediately offer anything in return, every hand pressed against a surface and left there as evidence, I was here, I existed, I was real, is a continuation of something that began in a cave, in the dark, at the edge of extinction, when a small group of people decided without deciding, through nothing more than the daily practice of their lives, that the human story was worth continuing. The ice retreated, they remained, and in remaining, in that stubborn, creative, compassionate, meaning-making remaining, they became everything that came after, including you.